The power of the inner critic inside of you is directly connected to the power of the critical voices which surrounded you when you were growing up. Parents, siblings, and teachers, these are the three culprits for your present day suffering. In a single sentence, I'll put it this way: the strength of the judgmental voices in the world around you are directly connected to the strength of the judgmental voices in the world inside of you. And this video is going to walk you through a 3-step process of identification, de-escalation, and integration to properly work with the inner critic subpersonality from a parts work-based perspective without sacrificing productivity or external metrics of success. So we're going to dive straight in with a game of inner critic bingo. Inner critic bingo, drawing straight from the appendix of this wonderful book, Embracing Your Inner Critic by Hal and Sidra Stone, who you may recognize from the voice dialogue method itself. Highly recommend this book too. But we're going to jump in with the top 12 traits of the inner critic. And as I go through these for the next minute or so, I want you to pause and reflect wherever you are and just listen for a yes or a no and the level of yes or no as you relate to these traits. This is basically the voice of your inner critic identified and put into a page. So, step 1, identification. Listen to see if it applies to you and how much it applies to you. The top 12 traits of the inner critic. Number 1, it constricts your ability to be creative. It stops you from taking risks because it makes you fear failure. It views your life as a series of mistakes waiting to happen. It undermines your courage to change. It compares you unfavorably with others and makes you feel less than. It is constantly warning you to not look foolish. It is terrified of being shamed and so monitors all of your behaviors to avoid this. It causes you to suffer from low self-esteem and possibly depression because it tells you that you are not good enough. It can make looking at yourself in a mirror or shopping for clothes miserable because of its ability to create such a negative view of the body. Some hard-hitting ones here, right? Number 9, it can take all the fun out of life with its criticisms. Number 10, it makes self-improvement a compulsive chore because it bases the work on the premise that something is wrong with you. Number 11, it doesn't allow you to take in the good feelings that other people have towards you. And the final one, the top 12 traits, it makes you susceptible and often victim to the judgments of other people. So that's the voice of the inner critic, and this is the first half of the first step. Again, I'm going to walk you through identification, know the enemy, de-escalation, take the sword away from the enemy, and integration and acceptance, which is to take the enemy actually as a part of yourself, which initially, although it may not seem very likely at all, actually had your best intentions in mind. We're going to work towards that. But right now we're identifying so that we can stop stabbing ourselves in the neck or shoveling food down our throat to suffocate ourselves from the inside, or otherwise destroying ourselves with dreadful toxic relationships by both externally and internally. Those are the top 12 traits. Now we're going to take it to the next level of fun, and this is a really practical exercise. This is where the inner work, inner critic bingo really comes through. We're going to rate your inner critic. Again, from the book, Appendix A and Appendix B put together. It's sometimes interesting how the end of the book can be more valuable than the start, but I'm going to give you all the goodies and you can read it in your own time. What I want you to do here, because I'm going to share my results at the end, no matter where you are, if you want to engage in 2 ways, I'm going to give you 2 invitations. Same thing again, yes, no. On a spectrum, there's 20 questions, and if you want to rate according to the structure in this book, you can't go to 0. You have to stay at 1. So 1 is no, but not never. And 5 is quite often. So 1 is rarely, 3 is sometimes, and 5 is frequently. And this definitely irritated me when I was doing it just before shooting this video, because I wanted to perfectionistically score as close to 0 as possible, but it means that your minimum is going to be 20, not 0. So let's go through it, and I'll share mine at the end as well, because I'm still working on this, but some significant progress over the multiple years of me doing this both for myself and the clients that I work with. A really fun questionnaire here. Take about 2 minutes. Really useful, identifying the inner critic. Okay, ready? Pen, paper, mental, calculator, whatever you want to do. Do you agree with these questions? 1, rarely. 5, frequently. Number 1, I wake up at night worried about the mistakes that I made the day before. Number 2, I replay conversations after I've had them to see what I've done wrong. Number 3, I don't like the way my clothes look on me. Number 4, when I'm with other people, I wonder if they're critical of me. Number 5, I'm cautious about trying anything new because I'm afraid of looking foolish. 6, I'm afraid people will laugh at me. Number 7, I worry about what other people think. Number 8, I often feel inferior to other people. And number 9, I wish I had a more attractive body. Number 10, when I look in the mirror, I check to see what's wrong with me. Number 11, when I read over something I've just written, I'm not satisfied with it. I wonder if I relate to that one. Number 12, I'm afraid that there's something basically wrong with me. 13, I wonder what other people would think of me if they really knew what I was like underneath. 14, I compare myself with other people. 15, I seem to attract judgmental people. Good range of questions there, right? 16, I question my decisions after I have made them and think that I might have done better. Could have done better with reading that question. Number 17, when I say no, I feel guilty. 18, interesting meta question. When I take a test like this, I'm not sure that I don't do as well as other people. 19, I avoid taking risks if I can help it. And the final question, number 20, when I think about self-improvement, I feel that there is something wrong with me that needs to be fixed. You'll have a score anywhere between 20, which is all ones for everything, and all the way up to 100, which is 5 points every single time, frequently for each question. For myself, I'll show you mine right there. I got 26, hopefully you can see that. And the questions which weren't a 1, and were actually a 2 out of 5, were number 3, I don't like the way my clothes look on me. Number 7, I worry about what other people think. 9, I wish I had a more attractive body. 11, when I read over something I've just written, I'm not satisfied with it. 14, I compare myself with other people. And 17, when I say no, I feel guilty. So again, it's not bad. I definitely was a lot more self-hating in the past. I went through about a decade or so of suicidal self-hating impulse. So how am I at the point where I only score 26 and not 100 again? A bit irritating that I still score 26 and not just 6, but we'll go with that. I've still got some perfectionist wounds to heal inside of myself. Clearly. We've identified the inner critic, and you'll be at the point now where, to a lesser or greater degree, you're going to realize that your inner critic has a certain degree of real estate capture inside of your psyche. So how do we disarm the inner critic? How do we take away the sword or silence the tongue which speaks within? Many ways, but I found that the best way, which is the way that I'm going to share with you, is psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is a broad catch-all phrase for education for the purpose of therapeutic outcome. That's a big way of saying I'm going to give you a little unlock which will actually provide 2 things. It's going to allow you to create the space from your inner critic, and then eventually it's going to allow you to integrate the inner critic, because you'll realize that the inner critic had good intentions all along. Again, we'll go back to the beginning. Where does the inner critic come from? Parents, peers, siblings, teachers. These are the judgmental voices of those people who are around you, which we internalize in psychological terms. This would be a way of creating almost a mental image or an internal archetypal relatable image, an internal object, as it were, that represents the possible, I suppose, characters in the environment. So a mother image, a father image, a teacher image, a romantic image, whatever it may be. And we'll have certain ideas and certain judgments, certain values, certain morals, which we almost protect ourselves from in advance. And the easiest way to protect against anything which is coming within is to already start that process from inside ourselves. The way to disidentify from the inner critic is actually the path of compassion, and it's the path of self-love, which we've covered in this series, but to go to self-compassion and self-respect as the two sides of self-love. From that very hating perspective, put this book down. That's too big a leap to make. What I invite you to realize is that because the inner critic is formed in childhood, usually consciously between the age of about 3 and 6, we are dealing with a very young child who is bolstering himself into the world, or herself, to seem bigger than they actually are. This is the 5-year-old boy or girl who is told, no, don't be so naughty or don't be so filthy, because they're enjoying playing in the dirt, or maybe they don't want to eat the food which doesn't feel good for their body, or wear the clothes that feel itchy, and they are giving a shameful, critical reflection from what should be, in ideal cases, ideal parenting, a pretty clear mirror, still guidelines and structure, but clear mirror. That 5-year-old boy or girl knows that he is bad or she is bad, because a 5-year-old hasn't got the cognitive capacity to work between dichotomies with a sense of nuance. This is why you have good guys and bad guys in the childhood stories. It's only a 5-year-old, but we mistake the feeling of grandiosity or all-powerful, as if the god or goddess were speaking to us from above as the inner critic in all of their power. But what I want you to consider is that that subpersonality is actually much closer to a child abuser subpersonality. The inner critic, from one angle of interpretation, is the parental or societal or teacherly child abuser who lives inside. And in that moment of recollection, unless you truly are deep into the suicidal depressive stage, there's a natural opening in the heart. There's an ability to create the spaciousness because, of course, we don't want to harm ourselves. So I'll go back into the book and then show you the next step. This is a quote from page 11, I think, about the inner critic's original intentions. Because this is where empathy comes in. How do we be empathic for the parent who says, no, that's naughty, don't do that? Well, actually, they do have, from one perspective, potentially, not in cases of extreme abuse, but even then there's a whole conversation about something like sexual abuse. What does it mean for a father or mother to go through that kind of process and cause harm to their child? It's distorted thinking all the way down, but that's a bit too much for this conversation, so we'll go in with the broad angle and you can paint it between the lines. What does the inner critic actually want? From Hal and Sidra Stone in the book, quote, the inner critic really wants you to be okay. It really wants you to make it in the world, to have a good job, to make enough money. In order to do its job properly, it needed to curb your natural inclinations and to make you acceptable to others by criticizing and correcting your behavior before other people could criticize or reject you. A little bit further on, its original intent gets lost in the sands of time. It's hard to even read that because that's really what's going on. The inner critic is a subpersonality, a part within the multiplicity of the psyche, which initially formed as a defensive, preventative mechanism to keep us safe. Again, imagine the 5-year-old or 6-year-old inside of you that is standing on a series of cardboard boxes with a child's plastic knight in shining armor set, with a sword or a bow and arrow, and they're just trying to keep themselves safe. And they're trying to learn what roles they need to take in society. They're trying to learn what is good and what is bad, but they can't do much more than that because they are a child. They can't understand nuance. They can't understand dichotomy. So when we go to back to the questionnaire and we have some of the questions like, when I say no, I feel guilty, that's one that came up for me. As an adult, there's a lot more nuance in that inner critical voice than when I was a child. If I said no as a child, perhaps, I'm not saying this is a real memory, maybe I'd be met with more aggressive energy because I was being defiant or naughty or whatever it might be. But of course, that's just a parental control tactic where, of course, the ego of the adult might not necessarily be the 40 or 50-year-old man or woman. It actually reverts to another 5 or 6-year-old who's playing this weird status game with their child as if that somehow is something which is going to benefit either of them. Definitely didn't experience at least a little bit of that. But most people do experience that. Most people, especially if they're intelligent, creative, gifted people of one sort or another, those started to come through in childhood, and I've seen clients in one-to-one situations again and again who report to me that when they were somewhere between the ages of 10 and 15 or so, they realized that they were smarter than their parents in one way or another. Of course, not every way, we can't get too grandiose, but the inner critic aims for that because it's very close to the perfectionist. Let's bring it back into practical application. So far in this video, we've identified the inner critic. We've looked at the traits of the inner critic, the voice or the way that he or she speaks. You've got a list or an understanding of how strong your inner critical voice is, and the stage of disarmament towards integration. My number one invitation is to realize that this is a small child taking on a big role. Within the internal family systems model, which we covered in the previous episode of this series, this would be called a burden. So a part is not its burdens. Key unlock here, another aim for disintegration or de-escalation of that critical charge. The inner critic subpersonality, if it's a defensive subpersonality, is not the burden itself. So it's not the weight that the inner critic bears, it's actually a younger part. And if you really want to unlock this internally, you could realize that the way to heal the inner critic is to heal the 5 or 6-year-old inside of you. Might be a little bit later, the inner child might be age 10, could even be a little bit earlier, age 3 or so. But if you unburden that part in the same way as if you imagine, let's imagine this as a boulder. There's a boulder on my shoulder, good rhyme there, and I'm a 5-year-old boy. What do I actually want to do? Well, I want to drop it. I want it to come off. If I'm forced to hold it here, I want to be as strong as I possibly can and as harsh on myself as I possibly can to try and keep that up and not disappoint those around me. But to unburden the inner child means to lovingly take off what is not meant to be held anymore, put it into a safe place, or even dissolve it entirely. This video is really an introduction to an intermediate level of understanding how to do this inner critic dissolution process, because the final stage for integration is not something which can be achieved overnight. For myself, the inner child work was at least a year of consistent everyday practice. I've done, again, episodes in this series on how to heal the inner child, but playfulness, understanding, compassion, respect, practice, friendships, it all comes together. The psychoeducation element will create the initial opening to realize that it's a smaller part who's playing big and that the voice shouldn't be taken too seriously. But in terms of practical steps, two things I'll recommend. The first mental game to play, the kind of mental jujitsu, is to parallel every inner critic voice that comes up. So for example, right now, I'm concerned that maybe I'm not presenting my idea just as well as I'd like it to be. So I'm actually not too self-hating at this point in my life, so it's difficult to even imagine. Let's imagine that I had the inner critic voice of, Jesus Christ, Jordan, you are stupid, you're tripping over your words, you're really not presenting this very good at all. You are a failure. To play the mental jujitsu is to temporarily irrationally do the opposite, which is, oh my God, Jordan, you are crushing this. You are articulate, you are brilliant, and you are commuting. I'm commuting this message on the train track of thought towards you with perfect precision. And so you can tell I haven't got the inner critic too active in this place. I'm happy to be messy because I'm laughing and I'm playful. But you'll notice if I was actually rigid, I wouldn't be able to laugh. I'd be like, You can tell when you're in that state. So temporarily flipping these kinds of judgments, that's a useful step. And then the second step is actually a marathon and multiple marathons in a row, but you can walk the pace. It's self-compassionate action, and it's integrating all of these ideas initially through psychoeducation. Highly recommend that you read this book, Voice Dialogue Manual, as well as the other parts, work-based approaches, internal family systems therapy, Jungian shadow work, psychosynthesis, humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology. You can go into all these spaces, and as you read the stories of others, you'll realize that it's not actually your voice. It's a cultural voice. It's an old legacy trauma from a harsher time, and you can even look back to Victorian child rearing. This is a bit of a final tangent to lead on, where children weren't really treated as children. They were treated as mini adults. They were sent to workhouses, at least in the UK, from the age of 8, or sometimes even younger onwards. And it's only recently that we've actually started to understand what it means to be a child who is vulnerable and fragile. If you can treat yourself as that vulnerable, fragile child in the moment where you're overcompensating with harshness, you don't need to lose or sacrifice your outer productivity. I can still complete this series and read these hundreds of books without being harsh on myself because it comes from a place of love. But to go from hatred to love as if it were a skipping step that you can make easily is entirely unrealistic. It takes multiple years sometimes. So if you're willing to put in that work and you're willing to be patient with the process, then inner work really is for you, and you're going to be in it for the long haul, which means you will get the long haul benefits. Takeaway for today, you know how strong your inner critic's going to be. You know that the inner critic is much smaller than it may actually appear. And with time, you can disarm and integrate that powerful voice into a much smaller, more realistic voice, which exists inside of you as one of the many parts and many subpersonalities, and progressively in the background. Next episode in Inner Work Essentials, we're going to actually be taking a U-turn, and we're going to be looking at a very different topic. You can see it up on the screen. I think it's reincarnation. I'll see you over there. If it seems unrelated, it is related. Trust me, I've structured this. You'll enjoy it.